Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to this webinar on new tools for heightened human rights due diligence. We're happy you're joining us so numerous to this online session, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. My name is Adrienne Gardaz-Quandat. I'm working with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights as part of the Business and Human Rights Unit, and also currently advising our division of field operations on specific business-related human rights matters. I've worked on issues of responsible business in conflict for many years now, and I'm very happy to be here with you in this online session and to moderate this discussion. Thanks to the VP Secretariat for inviting me. So we have 1 hour. The purpose of this session is to help you in your efforts to conduct conflict-sensitive business and to clarify this concept of heightened human rights due diligence and unpack what it means in practice. As we know, we often, most of the time, have very limited time to read, especially when managing operations in complex environments. And so this is an opportunity to learn about tools that have been developed recently that we hope will be useful to you as you work on managing your risks and impacts on human rights in complex environments. So we have with us today 3 excellent panelists to contribute to this discussion and to present tools to you. So let me briefly introduce them. First, we have Gerald Pachou, who has a long-standing record of experience in the field of business in conflict. He served as advisor to Professor John Ruggie, the special representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, and as such, he contributed and was closely involved in the development of the UN Guiding Principles. He also served at the UN, advising the Executive Office of the Secretary General on strategies on the role of the private sector in peace building. He participated in a big project on business, human rights and conflict led by the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, about which I will say a few words afterwards. And he is currently managing partner at Pluto and Associates, which is an advisory firm specialized in global public policy and corporate responsibility. So welcome, Gerald. We have also Claude Voya. Claude is economic advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross, where he is responsible for the development of the organization's relations with businesses operating in conflict. He has a very extensive field experience in different management positions in ICRC missions, especially in Africa and in the Middle East. And he has engaged a lot with companies from the extractive sector, notably when participating as an observer in the Voluntary Principles for Security and Human Rights initiative. He contributed to the development of the VP's implementation guidance tools, and he will say a few words about that later. And he's also leading a major partnership with the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. That is a project focusing on the development and the promotion of good practices for business operating in complex environments. So welcome, Claude, as well. Finally, we have Egbert Wesselink, who brings a tremendous amount of expertise to the table as well. Egbert is senior advisor at PAX, Dutch Peace Movement, where he leads the program on natural resources, conflict, and human rights. He's the author of a famous report entitled Unpaid Debt about the oil war in Sudan, and that's a report that prompted a war crime case in Sweden against London Energy and its 2 former CEOs. And you may have heard about that recently, as the case will go to court next year. He represents PACS in several multi-stakeholder initiatives, including the voluntary principles, where he initiated the work on model clauses and the conflict assessment tool. And in addition, he's also deeply involved in human rights work in Russia. So welcome, Egbert, as well. Before I turn the floor to our excellent panelists, I was invited to just say briefly a few words about the report released by the Working Group on Business and Human Rights about 2 years ago that addresses the issue of business and human rights in conflict and post-conflict context. It's a report that is the outcome of a research project that has been conducted by the working group in collaboration with other experts in response to the increase of the number of civil wars and of the different situations of violence and instability. It is focused on the implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in situations of conflict, and it articulates concrete and practical measures that states, business, and also the UN system should take to prevent and address business-related human rights abuses. So what's, very briefly, what can you find in this report? You'll find insights on actions taken by states as it relates to regulatory development or new corporate reporting requirements, as it relates to the state's advisory capacity that needs to be strengthened, or the role of home states of businesses operating in conflict. It also provides insights on what the UN system should do, in particular as it relates to addressing the disconnect between the expectations from that business incorporates peace and security issues in their strategies and operation, and the fact that actors in charge of developing peace policy are still very slow to fully integrate business in the development of policy strategies and programs. When it comes to business, the report here, it calls on companies to apply heightened human rights due diligence, and it addresses a number of aspects and questions related to that. But I'm not going to touch upon it because the panelists will discuss these aspects when presenting their tools. There's just one takeaway, one point that I would like to highlight as we start this discussion to lay the ground, and that's conveyed by this report. It's this notion or this idea that business operating in conflict cannot be neutral. It is a misconception to believe that business can avoid any impact in conflict by conducting rights-respecting practices, because even if business does not take side in the conflict, and even if it sometimes takes great care in not favoring one side over the other, the impact of its operations will necessarily influence the dynamic of the conflict. I just wanted to highlight this point to your attention before we start, because I think that's the underlying notion or idea that is under the tools that will be presented. So I don't want to take the more time. And I just want to say how we will proceed. I propose we proceed in 2 rounds of questions. The first round where the panelists will briefly introduce and present the tools that they have brought. And then a second round of questions for which I hope we'll have a little bit more time, where we will discuss more concrete scenarios, situations in which companies can find themselves, and how the tools presented can be used in order to address these kinds of situations. So if that works for you, we'll start with the tools presentation, and I would like to, starting with Gerald, with the guidance on heightened human rights due diligence for business in conflict-affected context that has been developed by UNDP, well, authored by Gerald, but developed by UNDP. And I'd like to invite you, Gerald, to tell us about the key elements of this guidance, to tell us how it is relevant now, for whom, in what kind of context, kind of issues that it can help to address. So please, Gerald, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you to the VPs to organize this, I hope, interesting discussion. In a nutshell, and you have hit all the main points, that this guidance builds on the report from the working group that was developed 2 years ago. And then we saw that even though the report tried to give some practical elements, the format of a UN report and the word limitation didn't allow to get into enough detail. So the working group collaborated with UNDP to try to articulate a little bit more in detail what it means to conduct this heightened due diligence. And so that's the guidance that was produced this year or last year. I think it shouldn't be seen as a tool. The idea was really to give some practical elements for companies to then do what we call this heightened due diligence. I wanted to underline 2 things. The first one is that this notion of heightened due diligence is not a new concept. It is front and center in the guiding principles. It's something that the guiding principles operating in conflict situations is something that the guiding principles underline simply because more violence means more human rights abuses and violations, and so more risks for companies to operate responsibly. Very basic idea, but over the last 10 years, we still saw some uncertainties on what it means concretely. So again, not a tool, but more of a guidance. I wanted to call it a blueprint, but I was denied my wish, because the idea is really to give businesses and those operating around businesses elements to conduct due diligence. And if you look at the guidance, which I'm sure you have all done in close details, you have seen that at the end of the day, the beginning and the end are the key element. We have tried to summarize in a first part called, if you read only one thing, the main elements that should be in mind for business. And basically, it is to say that when you do human rights due diligence, you look at your impact on people, but in conflict situation, you need to look at your impact on people, but also at the impact that your operations or activities can have on the context, because business activities, just like any other activities, are never neutral, and so you can unwillingly or unwittingly fuel conflict tension. So that's really the basic idea, and we give some elements to do that. And then what I hope will be interesting in this guide, in this blueprint, is the series of annexes where we have tried in a very simple way to highlight one, all the questions that companies, but also colleagues within companies that are not necessarily dealing with human rights or social impact can have. And then to have a very short summary on what it needs, what we need to have as a company in order to be able to run this heightened due diligence. And so we have what we call a capacity assessment and checklist, so that businesses and people working in businesses can have a very simple and quick ways to identify where they may have capacity gap. Then what to do will depend on the context and on the situation and all those different factors, but really to have the capacity to assess if we are ready, and then to see what needs to be done. There are a couple of other elements in the guidance on specific issues, such as how to run a grievance mechanism in a conflict-affected context, because it is a very specific situation, and we try to extract some good lessons learned, including from the ICRC in Colombia. That is one of the few public examples that we see. So I'll stop there, but really basic idea: read the beginning, read the end, and have a look at the annexes, because it might help you to see where you stand in terms of readiness, and it gives you a couple of leads on what to do to try to improve your capacities.
Excellent. Thank you, Gerald. Thanks a lot. And it's true, there's no excuse not to read the guidance, since at least the first few pages summarize very well the key messages. Great, thanks a lot. So I'll turn the floor to Claude. I think Claude wants to tell us about two different tools, right? The conflict prevention tool developed by ICRC and the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, DCAF, and the practical toolkit on security and human rights challenges in complex environment as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I'm going to upload a few slides that I have prepared for this purpose. Adrienne, do you see the slides?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, thank you.
Put the full slideshow, full screen. Voila.
Okay, thank you. So the first thing important to say, and you just mentioned this, is that I'm not only representing my organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, but also DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, because the tools that I'm going to present have been developed together with DCAF, as well as other actors. I'm going to come back to this. And thank you, Adrienne, and also Gerald, for insisting on this notion that in conflict situations, business cannot be neutral. I think it's very important to underline this, if at all, because we are hearing very often in our interaction with businesses this excuse or this defensive posture saying, yeah, but we are in conflict, but we are a neutral actor, we don't impact on conflict. So this is just untrue, as you have highlighted, and I think it's very important to underline this. So the two tools I'm going to quickly introduce according to two questions that were asked to us is, on the left side, the conflict prevention tool that was developed together with Queen's University in Canada, Anglo Gold Ashanti, and DCAF and ICRC. On the right side, the security and human rights toolkit developed by DCAF, ICRC, and the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. I just want to underline that these two tools, and you see this in the middle, are both available on the DCAF ICRC Knowledge Hub, as well as the other tools that are being discussed today. So one of the questions was the key purposes of the tool. So if I look at the first one, the conflict prevention tool on the left side, it's a tool that is meant to facilitate conflict prevention for business operating in challenging environments. It's a tool that is meant to promote a conflict-sensitive approach, focusing on both on-site level and regional level company impacts and actions. It's a tool that is meant to integrate the company's culture and the company's practices into the broader conflict analysis and conflict prevention and management issues. And in this sense, I think I wouldn't say it's completely new, but it's fairly new. Many of the tools ignore this dimension, I would say. And another of the key purposes is to trigger and encourage broad-based security and human rights discussions within the company and breaking silos within the company on discussions related to security. If we look on the other side, the toolkit, the DCAF ICRC toolkit or security and human rights toolkit, the key purposes there is to navigate complex environments or conflict-affected settings. It is to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law in such contexts. It is to provide guidance that companies can use, apply to address security and human rights risks in their operations. It is to assist companies establishing policies and processes in this regard, and on a broader scale, we could say to help companies build resilience and maintain their social license to operate in their operations. The other question we were asked is how these tools can help companies. So again, I'm going to go tool by tool. With regard to the conflict prevention tool, the different ways it can help companies is by triggering internal discussions and reflections on security issues. Again, I'm coming back to the point of these cross-company discussions that are necessary to be able to properly manage such issues. For this, there is a series of sample questions that can trigger these internal discussions. Internal and external, and external discussions. Some of these discussions obviously need to integrate other actors in particular local communities. Another of the ways it can help is well, focusing on conflict prevention tool, bringing some innovative elements. I underlined this earlier, recentering corporate culture as part of the conflict analysis and promoting these cross-function approaches to managing security issues that I underlined before. Then at the higher level, we could say that it will help companies managing their due diligence obligations very broadly. If we look at the security and human rights toolkit, so the main and central thing it brings to companies is to help them navigate complex environments. And it does so through a number of ways, and I have listed some of them as their various elements that you will find in the toolkit, such as developing conflict risk assessments, such as undertaking effective engagement with host governments, such as managing situations where public security will not be working appropriately at the level of expectations of the companies. Vetting the records of public and private security forces is another example, or any other ways to establish dialogues with community. In multi-stakeholder groups, there is a lot of emphasis on the usefulness and value of multi-stakeholder settings to prevent and manage tensions and social conflict. So these are the various elements these two tools can help companies. And I turn back to you so that we can listen to Egbert's tool. Thank you. I'm stopping sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Claude. Thanks a lot. And thanks for this presentation. Egbert, we get to you, and you will tell us about the conflict analysis tool for companies developed by the Voluntary Principles Initiative, and I think you've had an instrumental role in developing this tool. So please, go ahead. You're muted.
Right. Sorry for that. Yes, thank you very much, Adrienne, and welcome everybody. The violent conflict has been identified by the Voluntary Principles Initiative members 4 years ago as a major driver of security-related human rights violations that required extra attention. And one of the two choices were made. One is that to focus on intrastate conflicts, so not on anything with statal conflict, to look at it from an above site level and to and the conclusion of the analysis was, and then it's written down in our strategy, that the related risks require a proactive approach that includes actually tackling factors that drive conflict and, as it's called, to create an enabling environment for respect for human rights. So just going a step further from what is usual in the business human rights sphere, which is that companies trying to prevent that they, in one way or another, are directly linked or contribute to human rights violations. This is a much more active approach. Making conflict analysis is already a voluntary principles requirement for over 20 years, and but it was never clear what that meant. And so a working group is formed to develop a tool that should be practical and that should fit well with existing company policies and practices, so they could be easily woven into what they're already having. The working group is formed with more than half a dozen companies that had a lot of experience in this. CDA Collaborative that did most of the heavy lifting and actually wrote the draft of the tool, PAX, and it was chaired by John Drimmer, who did it really very well. Many of you will know him. So the tool itself is short and simple, much shorter text than the others, except for the university tool that Claude talked about. But don't be fooled. The challenge itself is not simple. It's a very complicated thing. And so using the tool well will not be a simple thing. The key purposes, and maybe say something about the other two, for instance, the work of the Gerald for the UNDP, he calls it a guide. I think everything that's in there is extremely relevant for our tool, and I don't think our short and simple tool can be used without taking everything that's in that guide into account. So the key purposes are firstly to understand the dynamics of conflict above site level, as I said. We all know that conflicts, I mean conflicts that also exist in absence of the company, so to speak. Security and human rights risks at site level, more often than not, are rooted in broader regional or society-wide conflicts. And the tool identifies these deeper causes of site level conflicts. So one of the main outcomes is the understanding and identification of conflict drivers, as well as factors that work against conflict, because in your response, it's of course very important if you're talking about conflict prevention to stimulate those. Secondly, so understanding conflict drivers and factors against conflict. Secondly, determine the company's connection and impact on these identified conflict drivers and actors, by the way. And thirdly, generate options to tackle conflict drivers and thereby create an enabling environment for human rights. Well, why it's needed is already said. I think there's one thing I'd like to say, because I mean, the reasons why we do it, why we think it's important, etc., is already very well articulated by all three of you. One thing, this is totally focusing on extractives, but I think these tools are also very important and relevant to investors and business partners of extractives, maybe for the entire business community. Because business partners and investors, of course, are connected to the business of companies who work or operate in or buy from conflict-affected areas, and they also got to do their due diligence. So we hope that using this tool may also help business partners and financial institutions to fulfill their due diligence obligation by expecting tools like this one to be used by their business partners. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Egbert, for highlighting these key elements of these tools. And we see that all of the tools presented here have been developed to really help in practice. But as we know, one may be fully equipped with tools and guidances on all aspects of human rights due diligence or a heightened approach to it, but sometimes there are challenges or dilemma that a company can face in concrete, in real life situations when it comes to where it becomes difficult to understand exactly how to go about all these guidance and recommendations and how to address the issue. So what we would like to do now, in order to go one step further into a concrete discussion, is to continue the discussion based on very brief scenario, concrete situations that we think companies, participants may face in reality, and see how to navigate these situations and how these tools can actually help. So I'd like to start with Claude, if it's okay for you, Claude, and propose a brief scenario so you can illustrate how to navigate that. So, for example, if we take a situation where a company finds itself in a country, operating in a country that includes areas of instability and also non-state armed groups operating, present in this context. Let's assume the company finds out that one of its local suppliers is being extorted by an armed group, and that supplier wants to raise the cost of the goods or of the services that he sells or supplies to the company because of the business losses that are due to this extortion issue. So how can the company navigate a situation like this one? What would you advise? And how can the tools that you have presented potentially help companies find a solution, or at least address this challenge?
Thank you. And as you can see, I'm taken completely by surprise with these questions. and I'm not going to respond how can the company, what I would advise the company to do on this, but rather looking at how the tools can help in such situations. So the challenge, as you just described it, is linked to the fact that companies operating in an armed conflict, linked to the fact that there is a likelihood of a system of weak governance, and linked to the fact that the company may be indirectly involved in possible violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. So looking at this, and now, this is one of the most tricky scenarios because there is very little guidance when it comes to engaging or managing the relationship with non-state armed groups. There has not been many organizations courageous enough to develop guidance on this. So it's one of the most challenging and sensitive issues. So the two tools I'm representing on, I'm showcasing here, none of them will provide, direct off-the-shelf solutions to this challenge, but both tools nevertheless can help either in identifying the issue early, which is very important, or in pointing to broad guidance. So if I look at the conflict prevention tool, as I indicated, this is a tool that is essentially a prevention tool. So the tool should act before the situation we describe here even occurs. The usefulness of the tool here is that through its cross-departmental or cross-sector approach that it encourages within companies, it will help identify these type of issues well before they materialize, if the companies are applying these tools and using these tools to their full effect. And the main benefit is not to find a solution to the problem when it occurs, but to identify the possibility or the likelihood of the problem ahead of time, which allows the company to prepare itself for this kind of scenario. So the main usefulness is that you would know this is likely to happen and you can plan ahead of time, versus you are taken by surprise and you have to react on a purely reactive mode and an emergency mode, which, as we know, is not going to offer the best responses. If I look at the security and human rights toolkit on the right, there are two ways where it can help. The first one is through the guidance that you find in the toolkit itself. And one of the ways to use the toolkit is to go through its structure of challenges. It is organized around challenges. And to try and find a challenge that will correspond to the situation you are faced with. Now, it happens that there is no challenge that corresponds exactly to this kind of situation. So you have to go by deduction or by similarity. And in this case, you will find some similarities going through the challenges of working with host governments in situations of weak governance, which is likely the case there, where you will find indirectly some advice or some good practices, as well as another angle is through engagement with communities, and in particular the section that deals with you know, the large extent of the different representations of the communities and the different groups within the community. And through both these challenges or both these areas, you will be able to find a number of good practices and recommendations that will be helpful to manage this situation. The other way to use it is to use the toolkit as a tool of tools. The toolkit is a tool of tools. So basically, it imports in the recommendations and good practices what you can find in a number of other tools. And there, if you go, for example, and I just did the exercise this morning, if you go in the toolkit and you do a string word search using non-state actors or non-state armed groups, I can't remember exactly, it will lead you in the toolkit to the sections where the issue is mentioned, and it will lead you to the one and rare resource that exists that is tackling directly with this topic, which is the CDA report that is listed at the very bottom. You know, business and non-state actors, dilemmas, challenges, and the way forward. So this is another way to find some guidance and responses by using the toolkit as a tool of tools. And I'm stopping here.
Good. Thanks, Claude. It's good to know that the Security and Human Rights Toolkit can be approached as a tool of tools, directing us to more specific tools addressing concrete issues. And it's true that the issue of the little guidance and little, let's say, literature or practical advice on how to manage relationships with armed groups for businesses has also been flagged by the working group in its report on conflict that I talked about before. And hopefully this will change, but until the time we have more guidance about this specific aspect, I think it's important to encourage exchange of experience between companies, with communities, with experts and other practitioners, in order to learn to already flag what are the kinds of issues that companies face with on groups, and try to find solutions. And talking about the importance of exchanging reminds me that I forgot to mention at the beginning to the audience that everyone is kindly invited to share questions or remarks or perspective, either at the end of the discussion, or I'd like to encourage you to to write your questions, if you have any, in the chat box, so we can address them if we have time at the end of the webinar. Sorry for missing that at the beginning. So time goes by fairly quickly. So we'll turn to Egbert. And I would like to propose another short scenario to Egbert. That's the one of a situation where another company operates in a country which seems to be stable, apparently, but where the country is governed, in fact, predominantly by one religious group, which controls most of the state apparatus, most of the economy, to the detriment of other groups, other religious groups. And as a result, the other groups tend to be excluded from the country's wealth creation and distribution, creating discrimination and grievances. And in this context, let's say the company is being pressured by the state to give jobs or to give contracts to the preferred or to the most powerful group, when the company is hiring, or when the company is concluding procurement contracts and providing goods and services. So in these kinds of cases, Egbert, how can the company navigate the situation? What would you advise in a situation like this one?
Thank you very much, Adrienne. Yes, this is not at all an imaginary situation. This happens a lot. If you're looking at our tool, basically our tool, after all the introductions, etc., it's 2 Excel sheets. That looks simple. They're meant to break down a very complex situation into manageable, digestible elements that you can actually work with and you can respond to. Because everything is connected with everything, but when you realize that too much, you don't know what to do anymore. So our tool is aimed at breaking that deadlock, and I think it can. But it does require, of course, a deep understanding of the background of what conflicts are, what human rights situation are, what situation the country is, etc. All the elements that you find in the ICRC and the ECAF tool and then the UNDP tool, etc. So you got, looking from that, one of the questions, we all know that why people fight, and the Pathways for Peace report, already 8 years old, I think, by the World Bank and the UN, clearly states in intrastate conflicts, people fight because of perceived inequality, exclusion, and injustice. Almost all intrastate conflicts are determined by that. The Voluntary Principles Initiative strategy mentions several specific important conflict drivers that members encounter. One is political, social, and economic exclusion and lack of opportunity, the absence of rule of law, very important for corporations that are essentially legal entities after all, insufficient civil space and ability to dialogue, repression, persecution of human rights defenders, poor human security, and there are more. Once you see that, you know, you need a conflict analysis, even if there's no actual conflict. If there's just if this stuff is present, but there's no violence, you still have a latent conflict that can break out. So we all know that exclusion from access to power, opportunity, service, and security creates fertile ground for mobilizing group grievances to violence. An exclusion that is enforced by state repression poses an extra grave risk to violent conflict, and that is clearly the case here. So I would qualify this situation as a latent conflict driven by state-supported group exclusion. So that will be, elements for the main conflict driver factors is here state-supported group exclusion. Why is this an issue? I think it's an issue for two reasons. Under the UNGPs, the scenario is a big issue because the state requests to discriminate for religious belief, and that is a human rights violations, and you're not supposed to cooperate with. And from the conflict angle, clearly abiding with the state's requests would mean that you would actively increase grievances and a sense of injustice and exclusion, and thereby raise the risk of internal conflict. So the demand is clearly unacceptable for a company that wants to respect human rights. Our tool would first identify that and then determine what the connection of the company is to the conflict, and to conflict factors and actors, if it supports religious discrimination. Well, it will obviously be perceived as a party to the conflict by both groups, both by the religious group that's supported by the state or that owns the state, and by the other one. The company is probably, by the way, already perceived as party to the group competition. Like you said, Adrienne, there's no neutrality in conflict. And their operations are already benefiting the party that dominates the state and not the other one. On the other hand, the risk is, of course, that non-compliance with state demands creates a risk of targeting by state and state-supported groups, and vice versa. So the connection is obviously there. And whenever a conflict will break out, the company cannot say, well, we're not here, we try to do our best, we try to be neutral. This is obviously impossible here. So what to do? The obvious answer is to influence the conflict driver for the good. And there is never a one-size-fits-all doing that. I think that this is always work in progress. And there are a lot of options there. I mean, they're mentioned in other tools, but it's always very, very specific. And you want to go into the specificities of this scenario, you need to know many more parameters. But quite obvious things that can be done is to advocate publicly and publish it, etc., a clearly merit-based hiring and procurement rules and policy. Seek cooperation with other businesses in country, mobilize your own government, identify and mobilize allies within the elite for equitable hiring and procurement policy. Train people in the country to comply with your rules in order to balance the chances, with the aim of balancing the outcome of your rules. Strengthening factors against conflict, as mentioned. In this case, one of the things one could do is to build a neutral corporate culture and show that, and show your position by making sure that you have and maintain are proud of a balanced workforce. I said alert and mobilize business partners in and outside the country, including your clients and finances outside. I mean, all these things are also always part of a political economy, and if you can argue to the powers that be that requiring this from you is very bad for the investment climate in the country, that could make a little difference. And of course, and that's always a difficult discussion with companies, I think being prepared when push comes to shove to close shop, unless if you're extorted to do things you're not supposed to, you don't want to do. If you're prepared to do that, that will greatly strengthen the credibility and the impact of your actions. What we often see is that companies fall in the trap of justifying negative impact on a big issue with pointing at their positive impact on minor issues. I think shouldn't be done. A very important element of this tool is that whatever measures are taken, that they are carefully monitored and evaluated on a permanent basis. That's it for so long.
Yes, thanks. Definitely, that there are many things that can be done, but when taken by surprise, it's obviously more difficult. But you made a nice bridge to the next scenario when talking about the option or the possibility to have to close shops, and how you get to that and how to justify that and approach these kind of situations. I'd like to, with that, turn to Gerald, who is advising companies operating in conflict-affected settings, who has looked thoroughly into a variety of cases, including very problematic situations. And I would like to ask your views in relation to situations where a company becomes linked to a conflict without necessarily being operating in the active conflict zone. And that's a case that we can compare to Russia today, for example, which is a situation where many multinational companies are having difficult challenges and dilemmas today as to how to go about these situations where you're not operating in the zone of conflict, but nonetheless you are linked to the conflict, regardless of what you do. How would you navigate these kinds of situations? What would you advise a company to do in such situations, Gerald?
Thank you, Adrian. Yes, it's one of those scenarios that we are confronted today, and that very honestly are a blind spot in our reflections over the last few years on business and conflict, because the scenario of a traditional international war was very far off our mind. It's something that we didn't do when we developed the guiding principles, always focusing on conflict zones. It's something that we didn't really touch on in the UN report from 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and that, no pun intended, blew up in our face with Ukraine. And here, I think it's important to realize for business that the responsibility to respect human rights is a principle-based approach. And so if we apply the basic principles of the responsibility to respect human rights, we have the beginning of an answer. And the cornerstone of everything is this direct connection between the harm and the business activities. So if we use that as a guiding principle, we can start to see a solution to the dilemma of being in an aggressor country. And it seems quite clear that if the activities of a company in such a country are not connected to the harm, meaning are not connected to the war effort, their presence in terms of respect for human rights is not problematic. It might be the right advice to leave or to suspend operations, but we need to realize that it's beyond the responsibility to respect human rights. And to be crystal clear, I think that considering the egregiousness of the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, which is probably, on the scale of bad things a state can do all the way up there, it's really a strong political signal to suspend or to boycott or embargo. But it needs to be clearly differentiated from the responsibility to respect human rights. And when a company decides to suspend or terminate operations, they need to take into account the human rights impact of that decision. So that's the framework for operating in Russia. But I think it's extremely important not to have something that we have seen at the beginning because of the emotions at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, an automaticity disguised under respect for human rights. And again, it doesn't mean that it's a way out for companies to stay in all contexts at all times. For instance, in Russia, something that wasn't discussed so much in an interesting way is that at first you could have this analysis and trying to see the connection to the war efforts. But with the mobilization law that came into effect a couple of weeks ago, that requires all businesses to disclose the information about their employees to send them to the war, then the connection is there. And so it becomes extremely difficult for business to keep on operating responsibly in Russia. Of course, it deserves a long discussion and we don't have the time around the essentiality of the service provided and so on and so forth. But I think that the principles to have an educated decisions are clearly there, and we try to cover it in the UNDP working group guidance to try to give those elements to the companies. But just to underline something that Egbert said and is, I think, essential and goes to the core of the guiding principles is this idea of know and show. Decide what you want, but be able to articulate why it is that you have taken the decision. And I will abuse my position, speaking very fast, of last speaker to just echo two points that were made. The first is on armed non-state actors. We have tried to give some guidance in the latest publication on how to engage armed non-state actors, but it is something we still need to work on because it is something we have no clue and is an absolute difficult dilemma for companies in conflict zones. We talk about all the actors. We have a lot of guidance on community engagement and whatnot. And yet in conflict, by definition, you have people fighting. We ignore one side of the fighting. So that's something we need to have more clarity on. And even more quickly, a last point. One of the key elements of heightened due diligence or operating in conflict zones is to have this sequenced approach on doing a conflict analysis and then only a human rights analysis, because sometimes the human rights analysis, and I'm thinking about the case that Egbert presented, could lead you to actions that will fuel the conflict. If you are in a context where one group has been favored, including access to education, if you have a perfectly non-discriminatory hiring policy as a company, you may well favor the dominant group and then fuel those tensions and contribute to conflict. So it's extremely important. It's a point that is made. First, conflict dynamics, then human rights dynamics, and then the decision. Thank you.
Good. That's clear and practical. Yes, Egbert, I was about to give you the floor. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to go one step further. I think the background, the time when the UN guiding principles were drafted, the idea was that human rights are universally accepted, endorsed by all countries, etc., etc. I think we're looking at a different world now. I mean, 2 of the 5 permanent members of Security Councils have foreign policies with objectives to destroy the human rights system in the world. And they are actively pursuing that in their political and business strategies. So the idea that, I mean, one of the reasons why companies signed up to human rights was, of course, that they accepted this idea that you could do that and remain politically neutral. But you can no longer in this world. respecting human rights is a political position. Respecting human rights makes you very, very, and standing up for it makes you very, very unpopular in many, many countries in this world. Well, look at how the FIFA is degrading itself. It's scandalous. Yeah? There they talk about human rights and they forbid their teams to wear the simple love symbols. Yeah, it's all totally politicized, and in that sense, I think we need to revise a bit the scope of the of how we look at the UN guiding principles. It's no longer just respecting, so kind of, you know, keeping a clean hand. It should be now actually promoting, like all organs in society are called upon to do in the Universal Declaration's preamble. And I like this concept of creating an enabling environment for human rights. And yes, so the idea that it could be okay to continue working in Russia in this this time is very problematic for me, because it's not just what you as a company yourself within your own sphere of influence directly influence. It's also what your position is in the great questions of this world that are driving all the human rights issues.
Thank you, Egbert, for this very interesting, although not very encouraging perspective, but nonetheless really useful. That should be the object of another discussion, because unfortunately we are pressed by time. We're already over time, but I didn't want to cut you in these important remarks. I'm afraid we won't have time for questions with the audience. I don't see any questions in the chat box. In any case, just a comment from a participant stressing the importance of engaging in multi-stakeholder settings, of multi-stakeholder initiatives, and Claude and Gerald agreeing with that. So I think we'll leave it at that. We are already well equipped with tools to look at that hopefully will help in managing risks and impacts in conflict. I'd like to thank the panelists for your excellent presentations and insights. And I would like to also thank the audience for joining us in this online session, and the Secretariat of the Voluntary Principles for convening it. So I wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you for participating, and I hope we'll meet again soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.